Well, good evening and welcome to the ACT branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name is Heath McMichael and I'm branch president. In recent meetings, we have been focusing on big power rivalry around the world in US foreign policy, Afghanistan and the consequences of Brexit. These developments have been playing out against a background of rapid changes around the globe. Previously accepted international norms in trade, security and diplomacy are under threat, not just from COVID-19, but also emerging state and institutional players. Australia has benefited from a rules-based world order, but as contestation replaces cooperation, we are confronted with new economic and other challenges. But fortunately, we have an expert speaker on hand tonight to help us unpack the drivers behind these changes and explain the implications for Australia and our region, the Indo-Pacific. Dr. Merriden Varrall is Director of the Australia Geopolitics Hub at KPMG, which provides strategic risk management for businesses navigating the complex global geopolitical environment. Merriden is exceptionally qualified to lend us her insights. From 2014 to 2018, she was Director of the Lowy Institute's East Asia program. Before joining Lowy, she was the Assistant Country Director and Senior Policy Advisor at the United Nations Development Program in China. Merriden spent almost 8 years living and working in China, including lecturing in foreign policy at the China Foreign Affairs University. Merriden has a PhD in Chinese foreign policy from Macquarie and the Free University in Amsterdam. She has a master's degree in international affairs from the ANU and an undergraduate degree from the University of Technology, Sydney. Now, before we begin, some housekeeping. Merriden will speak for 20 to 25 minutes before we take questions, which I will curate from those you submit from the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen there. So please keep your questions focused and refrain from sending us long comment pieces if you don't mind. I will try to get through as many questions for Merriden as possible before we finish at 7 p.m. sharp. So without any further ado, let me hand over to Merriden.
Thank you, Heath. Thank you for that introduction, and hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this discussion about geopolitical trends in the Indo-Pacific and the implications of COVID-19. So I've only got 20 to 25 minutes to get across and into all of these issues, and they're big and they're complicated. So let's get cracking on them immediately. The overall picture that we're looking at here is a world that is changing very rapidly. And the region that is so close to us, the Indo-Pacific, can certainly be seen as one of the central focal points of that change. The volatility that we're seeing is being both driven by, as well as in itself driving, major geopolitical, what some might call macro trends. And these are four that I think are really helpful to help us understand as an analytical framework some of the events that we're seeing in the headlines coming out of the region and indeed around the world. And those four themes are these. Firstly, structural changes in the international system. Secondly, citizen unrest and the rise of populism. Thirdly, the tech revolution. And lastly, climate change. So this presentation will look into these four geopolitical themes and how they're unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region and how COVID-19 has impacted the trends and the trajectory for the Indo-Pacific, taking all of these into consideration. We know that the world is in flux. We do see it in the news all the time, every day bombarded with events that perhaps even 5 years ago seemed very unlikely, if not inconceivable. Now, of course, the world has never stood still, but the depth and speed of change we're witnessing at the moment, we can probably fairly say hasn't been seen in our lifetimes. And COVID-19 has exacerbated that volatility. Now that's true globally, and it's certainly true in this region, which will include India and call the Indo-Pacific for ease of reference. So let me talk you through these macro geopolitical themes as being a lens through which we can understand the interconnections among those headline events, the connections and the broader trends. So the first trend, as I mentioned, is this idea of structural shifts in the international system. Now, we tend to take the international system for granted. We understand it as being a fairly, as Heath mentioned, the system as it stands and the rules-based order has served Australia very well. But it's important to remember that the international system is a construct, and it was very deliberately built after the Second World War and further reified after the Cold War. And that international system, that was a constructed system by the victors from those conflicts, is being eroded. Now, we hear a lot of alarmist cries of the end of the liberal democratic world order, and they're true. It is unraveling, but it's by no means as simple as identifying one or another key antagonist, understanding that if we get them to play by the rules of that system that's been created, then the system will be all set to rights again. It's so much broader than that, and it's so much deeper than that. We're really seeing the economic, military, socio-demographic, technological and political realities shifting fundamentally. We're seeing the locus of power move away from the Anglo-European West and their understanding of how the world should work, and it is a normative understanding. And we're shifting towards the East, including the Indo-Pacific region. We're seeing the rising wealth and power of this region, and of course, in particular, of China. Now, it's not just those powers becoming more powerful that matters. The response of the status quo powers to that shift really makes a difference to how our world is working. So we're seeing this, for example, playing out when countries like China, Brazil, wanted to have more rights, for example, in the IMF, in the International Monetary Fund, and other international institutions. And they were systematically and deliberately denied that voice that they believed was commensurate with their size and their weight in the world. And so as an effect of that, China, it's overstating it to say that it gave up on the IMF, but because it couldn't achieve the voice that it wanted and the representation it wanted in those existing institutions, it launched the AIIB, the Infrastructure Investment Bank, second only in importance to the AIIA, of course. So those structural shifts that we're seeing between, the existing status quo powers and those rising powers, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region, is playing out most clearly in this US-China strategic competition. Now, that competition has reached a point where it's absolutely entrenched on both sides. To make a simple point of it, from China's point of view, the US has a long-held goal of trying to keep China weak, trying to keep China down by victimizing and bullying it. That fits into some narratives that it really are central to how China sees itself and its role in the world. So with that in mind, it's politically impossible for China and for China's leaders to be seen to acquiesce to anything that the US imposes on it. From the US perspective, we've seen hard, hawkish views really solidify over the past 5 years. I think 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when I was in the US talking to officials and policymakers and think tankers, there was still a discussion or debate around what to do about China. I think that has been very much cemented into one fixed perspective, that China is not prepared to play by the rules and become a responsible stakeholder. It's been given every opportunity to do so from this US perspective, and it hasn't. And so therefore we need to now compete with it and try to contain it. So that view is very firmly held from top to bottom and from left to right in the US political and policy establishment. The trade war is an example of this entrenched antagonism between both sides. It started out being about trade, at least from the US side, but it's swiftly moved to being a proxy for issues of national pride, international power and containment. So those trade issues were very swiftly politicized and used as instruments of national power. Now, depending on whether Biden pursues it, phase 2 of that trade war is very unlikely. It was probably unlikely under Trump as well. The last 20% of those trade negotiation points are really non-negotiable elements for China because they represent elements of the China dream of rejuvenation, which are just politically untenable to make any moves on. And so that's, for example, the kinds of reforms to state-owned enterprises that have been put out in by the US. Not to say no reforms of SOEs are possible, but not these particular kinds of reforms. Reforms around foreign ownership, These kinds of things are very key to the Chinese government's political agenda of bringing China back to what they see as its rightful role in the world. The tech war is another example. This bifurcation in technology and these different pursuits of technology, which I'll talk about a little bit more when I talk about tech, both sides are determined to be preeminent in the technology space for both national security reasons and economic reasons, but it's an absolute sort of head-to-head battle there. Does Biden make a difference? Can we expect to see any kind of reset from Biden, from the policies of Trump? As I mentioned, hawkishness is now endemic in the US system. Biden looks set to have a different approach in the how, but the fundamentals of the what are the same as Trump. We won't be expecting a reset from Biden in the overall goals and expectations of the relationship. Biden will take a different approach. It'll be more targeted, more multilateral, more process-driven, which will take the heat out of the relationship without, the kind of sudden, unexpected Twitter-based foreign policy. And that could make things better for Australia as well. But at the same time, Biden is going to expect allies like Australia to step up and do more in this relationship. For example, freedom of navigation operations might be an area that the US expects more from Australia on. Signals have been that Australia hasn't been willing in the past, but it may be more willing to do so now. We've seen Australia step into spaces that it has been unwilling to take until very recently. So one example is the Malabar military exercises in November 2020. Australia's declined to participate in those since Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, because there was a fear that by doing so, we would antagonise China. Last year, we did participate in those exercises. Australia's involvement in the Quad with Japan and the US and India suggests that we are more willing to step up and take a position than we might have been in the past. Just recently, we've had the Quad get together and agree on vaccine cooperation. And as a quick reminder about what happened there, in March this year, US President Biden hosted leaders from Australia, India and Japan to discuss what Biden calls practical solutions and concrete results for global challenges. And that includes climate change, cybersecurity and COVID-19. And as part of that latter point, COVID-19, the group plans to harness the medical and manufacturing capabilities of the 4 countries to massively increase COVID vaccine production and distribution, mostly for other Asian and Pacific Island countries, but also for the COVAX group of nations. Their goal is to get 1 billion doses administered by 2022. Now, it's touted as a health initiative, a diplomatic initiative, but it's also very clearly and explicitly articulated as a highly strategically significant initiative based on that Quad's shared principle of a free and open Indo-Pacific, where countries are able to pursue their sovereign rights without fear of coercion from others. Now, as the US raises these expectations of Australia and Australia's role in an alliance to contain China as part of that strategic competition, it's likely to make things worse for Australia and the Sino-Australia bilateral relationship. Now, you know as well as I do that the Sino-Australia relationship is at a low point, very likely the lowest that it's been for decades. This is a long and complicated genesis, and it's certainly not as simple as going back to the pursuit of spearheading the COVID inquiry last year. It goes back a long way before that, and there's a lot of other aspects to it. And what that means is that it's not that simple to unravel. This is going to continue. Now, these structural shifts that I've been talking about, the rise in wealth and the weight and the power of Asian actors, and the response by the status quo powers, have been exacerbated by COVID in various different ways. Of course, COVID has hit Asia very hard, the region very hard, and is still continuing to do so. But the basic trajectory perhaps has slowed down, but hasn't shifted. So that has enormous implications for the dynamics of the region, security, political, and business. So I'm going to move now on to the second theme, this idea of citizen dissatisfaction. Domestic discontent is rising around the world, and this is in many ways related to the first theme, and indeed all of the themes are interrelated, interconnected. More and more people around the world are feeling that the system isn't working for them. They're becoming more and more angry that inequality is the hallmark of the times, that the globalization project hasn't worked for them. What we're seeing there is a strong sense of anger and growing mistrust towards the establishment, and that includes the political and the business status quo. Now, this lack of trust in itself is manifesting as anti-elitism, and we're seeing populations moving away from the centre politically to the extreme left or the extreme right, to identity politics, religious politics, but certainly moving away from a kind of central path of political convergence around the world. The rising trend of populism is part of this phenomenon of domestic discontent, because politicians around the world are taking advantage of disillusioned citizens to promote their own political agendas. Now, in a brief moment of political theory, populism as a political style involves some shared traits. Firstly, the idea that the leader creates or exploits a divide between a constructed other and ourselves, the people, of which the leader, of course, identifies as being a member. A populist leader demonstrates alignment with the people by demonstrating really strong non-elite behaviour or even bad manners. And the leader creates or exploits a crisis in which they can naturally position themselves as being the only one able to resolve. Now, when a populist leader brings these approaches together, particularly that approach of being one of the people and differentiating themselves from the elite or the status quo against whom there is all that mistrust, the leader can naturally position themselves as being outside of the power controls that democratic institutions maintain. So, for example, we have democracy being about voting and elections, but other key elements of democracy are those institutions to maintain power and maintain checks and balances on power, I beg your pardon. So we're thinking about a free media, a robust and vibrant civil society, and independent rule of law. So populists deliberately erode and undermine those democratic institutions domestically, and internationally, their skepticism and their suspicion of multilateralism, of international cosmopolitanism, of globalization means that they also erode institutions internationally as well. So we can look at Trump and the WTO as a really classic example of that. So that nationalist and protectionist policy agenda plays out in the international arena. So what we're looking at here is, in the region, while it looked as if democracy a few years ago was advancing, populism has been really making quite large gains in our region over the past few years. And we're seeing leaders use similar strategies as elsewhere in the world, as I said, positioning themselves as outsiders who can solve the problems where those untrustworthy elites have failed, being tough on crime or other things, and using identity politics to solidify that support base that's really built on an us versus them kind of mindset. So there's differences between the populism that we see in our region and in Europe and North America, because the circumstances around free trade, growth and immigration are different, and some of the key issues on which populists base their position. Populist politics in our region focuses on religious and ethnic divides and appealing to the frustrations of the working and lower middle classes, which of course is the majority in most cases, and their collective anger about how they feel that democracy has failed to deal successfully with inequality or crime or delivering the basic goods and services that they expect. The results are the same regardless. We're seeing the destruction of democratic institutions in our region. For example, Duterte in the Philippines has systematically removed the balances and checks on power, and we're seeing similar tendencies in India with Modi, among others. Now, COVID has not shaken populism. If anything, it's going to be exacerbating it. What we're looking at here is a K-shaped recovery. Although Modi in India, among others, has talked about a V-shaped recovery, what we're talking about here is where a recovery in which the wealthy elites recover faster than the majority of the poorer and already marginalized. So that K-shape, which means inequality is going to increase. So the grounds for populism that already existed are going to be further entrenched and exacerbated by COVID in the region. So we'll be seeing more unpredictable policies. We'll be seeing more inward focus. We'll see more political rather than economic logic. And we will be seeing more volatility and instability in our region as a result of this. The third area I want to talk about is technology. Some people describe this as the fourth industrial revolution, and I think that doesn't overstate the importance of tech, digital, cyber, and data developments. If we talk about disruption, or we talk about revolution, we talk about great change, I think it limits our imagination about how extraordinary these changes are going to be. I mean, obviously, it's exciting that we might be able to have driverless cars, or that our fridges might order milk for us when we run out automatically. That's great. But what we're talking about here is a reordering of our social interactions, of our relationship with production, with capital, with power, in ways that really are much more reminiscent of previous industrial revolutions. They're going to fundamentally shift the way that we live. Now, tech is supremely geopolitical. It's driven by and it drives politics. And these geopolitical pressures on the tech realm are going to only intensify as countries begin to emerge from COVID and cybersecurity challenges mount, and concerns about the power of tech platforms and the regulation around tech platforms begin to translate into regulatory moves in key markets. And we've seen that in Australia, for example, with Google and Facebook just recently. Major issues in this space include cybersecurity, the implications of AI and machine learning on jobs, and this tech split between the US and China. So very quickly, that issue of cybersecurity. In just the last few months, just the beginning of this year, we've seen two very big cyber campaigns. SolarWinds, which is attributed to Kremlin-backed cyber actors, which seems to have been largely an intel gathering effort, and more recently, apparently Chinese actors exploiting a vulnerability in Microsoft software. Now, this is going to inspire more calls for progress on some kind of international cyber norms, including a mechanism for imposing enforceable rules around state behaviour in cyberspace. But this has proven so far elusive, and it's likely to remain elusive until there's been some significant and destructive incident. But as the line between the online world and the physical world continues to blur, and 5G means that more and more economic and general life activity shifts online, it's going to become very difficult for policymakers to balance between sanctions, diplomatic measures, stronger defences, and deterring cyber adversaries without escalating the issues. AI and jobs is an area that's particularly important, and I think particularly pertinent to our region. Automation, AI, and machine learning is having a fundamental impact on employment, and COVID again is accelerating and exacerbating these trends. Now, in the US alone, it's projected by the end of this decade that 45 million workers could be displaced by automation, which pre-pandemic was predicted as 37 million. Interestingly, though, the total number of jobs is projected to increase, but that job growth is going to be in high-wage occupations, those skilled occupations at the very top level of our sort of socio-demographic hierarchy. The workers with low-skilled jobs are the vast majority, and they will be the ones who lose out from automation. If they're not already unemployed, and they will become unemployed, and the quality of their jobs is likely to fall. And we will need to see considerable efforts from governments in the region when this is rolling out, when this is occurring, and from corporations to retrain and reskill those workers so that that marginalisation doesn't turn into political unrest and tensions. The implications for already disenfranchised, marginalised and angry populations are quite thought-provoking. And the last angle on this tech point is the tech split between the US and China. Now, we've talked already about this strategic competition between the two, but both are set on competition and decoupling in the tech space in particular. China is determined to be preeminent in technology and AI, and it's also determined to ensure that technology is entirely aligned with the party. Xi Jinping announced that the state would be further increasing its oversight of China's large platform companies like Alibaba and Tencent, and we've seen regulations really tightening around those big companies. China is doing everything it can to become independent in the cyber and tech space as part of its Made in China 2025 strategy, which is a plan announced in 2015 to reduce the reliance and dependence on foreign technology, increase its competitiveness in cutting-edge industries, and move China's manufacturing up the value chain. Equally, the US is also determined, although it's rather belatedly so, not to let China be preeminent and to take up the foremost role in this AI and tech space. It's not traditionally been great on industrial policy, but it is trying to catch up very quickly. Both sides are actively courting the other parts of the world to join their team. So we've seen that play out with 5G and Huawei, for example, where the security implications and the political questions around 5G and Huawei's role in 5G have caused a great deal of soul searching and critical thought in countries around the world. Both countries have very different philosophies on what digital is, what tech is for, and who should be in charge of it, how it should be used. So as this tech war evolves, what does this bifurcated space mean for politics, for security, and for trade, particularly in our region, where countries in our region, including Australia, have already for so long been challenged by balancing between US and strategic and defense interests and China with economic interests. It was all very well as the two horses were riding along in parallel, but as the two horses are now in strategic competition, that balance is becoming increasingly difficult to manage and really is going to cause a lot of pressure for Australia and other countries in our region. The last theme is climate. Now, the warming of the planet is perhaps one of the least appreciated elements as a driver of geopolitical risk globally and in our region. Climate change drives geopolitics and again is driven by geopolitics. We know the direct environmental impacts like extreme weather events, storms, floods, cyclones, bushfires, droughts. We live through most of them here in Australia, and we observe through our own lived experience how they're increasing and becoming more common. But we have to think as well, not just about these first order impacts of extreme climate events, but how these flow on into other areas of geopolitical risk. So thinking about, for example, movement of people, migration, refugees within countries and across borders. What does it mean for urbanization, for the shape of future cities? What does it mean for the emergence of new diseases, including more pandemics as the permafrost melts and temperatures become more tropical, and that bacteria that's been sitting, resting quietly, frozen under the ground for thousands of years, starts to emerge. We have to think, of course, about sea lanes as the Arctic ice melts, and we're seeing great power geopolitical rivalry, really old school kind of rivalry play out up there in the Arctic. One example that is quite pertinent to our region, of course, is the Mekong River in Vietnam. 70% of the Vietnamese population relies on the Mekong River for their livelihoods and well-being. But for the last few years now, every year has seen new lows of water levels in the Mekong River. Now, part of that is because of upstream damming, and part of that is because of drought. So the geopolitical implications of that, as 70% of the population in Vietnam is no longer able to pursue its traditional well-being, means that we're going to see refugees within the country and enormous displacement of people in country, cross borders. And that's just one country. This is playing out around the region in various different ways, and is going to have enormous implications for the stability and the security of the region, ASEAN centrality, the growth and development of the region. We saw how migrants and refugees coming into Europe push the political spectrum very far to the right in that case. So the potential for real political turmoil and tension is very real. Now, just very quickly, on April the 22nd, we saw the Earth Day Climate Summit being hosted by US President Biden. Seen as a coming out party for the US, a re-engagement in the global leadership role. We saw some very ambitious commitments from a number of important global actors, including an enormous change in direction from the US, stronger emissions targets, and earlier timeframes for reducing carbon and becoming a net zero economies. Now, as it stands, despite the ambition, it is not enough to rein in global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels as per the Paris 2015 goals. So this has extremely serious implications for the Indo-Pacific region, which is particularly vulnerable to climate change, both in the physical first order impact sense, but also in terms of those flow-on impacts. Now, I'm conscious of time and I've only got a couple of minutes left, but let me just talk a little bit about COVID in the region and how that's playing out right now. Now, I mentioned already that COVID is further complicating already existing geopolitical trends and challenges for the Indo-Pacific. Looking at Philippines, Malaysia, and to a lesser extent, Thailand, they're now experiencing more severe second and third waves of the pandemic. Now, although Indonesia's outbreak has subsided, the country's at risk from new variants like the rest of the region is, and an expected surge in travel at the end of Ramadan in mid-May is likely to see another peak. With the exception of Singapore, inoculation campaigns are progressing very slowly in most countries in the region and are unlikely to pick up until at least June, when it's hoped that more supplies will become available. India has halted its vaccine exports at the moment because of its own worsening crisis, and that could affect other countries in the region, including the Philippines, which has contracted, for example, 30 million doses of Novavax from India. And while we're on India, that second wave that India is now currently experiencing is creating some political turbulence for Modi, Prime Minister Modi. Now, he's still the most popular politician in the country, but with states experiencing vaccine shortages, states imposing movement restrictions, which was putting pressure on the economic recovery, the prediction that Modi has made that the recovery will be V-shaped is looking extremely unlikely. The IMF predicts that at best, recovery to pre-COVID levels might be at the end of 2022, but the chair of the Reserve Bank of India is looking at 2033 for India to get back onto pre-COVID growth. So how these countries manage COVID and the COVID recovery will have enormous implications for geopolitics in the region. It's placing pressure on the leaders, but not as enough right now to look like it's shaping the political direction in another way. But the K-shaped recovery that I talked about before is going to increase inequality, which will have flow-on effects in terms of the political instability that we are already seeing. How countries build back and invest in their infrastructure to recover from COVID, and the extent to which they build back green, will have, again, longer-term implications for their future stability and security, in particular around climate change. So I'm just going to leave it there and open the floor up for any questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Merriden, for a clear and comprehensive elucidation of the four main drivers affecting change around the world. We've got some questions coming in, but I might get the ball rolling with a couple of my own. First of all, when we're looking at Australia and other middle powers, many of whom also have democratic backgrounds, what role do you see for those sorts of countries? India, you've already mentioned, Indonesia, South Korea, and so on, in trying to reinstitute some of the rules that have been under threat in various ways. That's the first point. And the second point is, to the extent you can, of course, when you're talking with business, give us a feel for how business views the developments that you've been outlining here. As the drivers of investment and trade, it's presumably critical to know what they're thinking and what their priorities are. You mentioned, of course, with the issues of automation and the things that underlie investment decisions. I mean, what sort of role do investment houses have in the changes in our region? So with that, I'll hand to you for the time being.
Thank you. Okay, those are great starting questions. And if I may, I'll answer them the other way around. I'll answer the second question first. So how business views these developments in Australia? Well, it depends a little bit on the industry and the sector that we're talking about, because they're differently exposed to geopolitics depending on how complicated their supply chains are, where their manufacturing is, to what extent they're trying to export to various different markets. But they certainly, I think in Australia, we've been very fortunate for many years that we've been able to keep politics and economics and business separate from each other. But that is fundamentally changing now. And I think business is waking up to this reality in which it cannot function as if economic logic is going to be the logic that dictates how they operate in the region and around the world. So they're seeing these geopolitical trends with concern. They're seeing them as something that they really are going to need to focus on. And as I said at the outset there, it depends on the sector as to how exposed they are. So we just released a paper just this week on geopolitics and education and the higher education sector in Australia. Now you can imagine very clearly and very simply the degree to which they're exposed to geopolitical variations and volatility, and the extent to which they're concerned about that. And what is it that they can do about it is the next really major challenge for them. And that's probably true to varying degrees of all of our industry sectors, how exposed they are, and then what are they going to do about it? And then the question comes to diversification. And diversification is much, much easier said than done. It seems like a great idea, but when we're talking about all of those other challenges in our region in particular, which would be perhaps the first line of potential options in a diversification strategy, diversification suddenly is far more complicated. So certainly the business community is very provoked by these geopolitical trends, is becoming increasingly aware of them, and is building them in, starting to really build them into their strategic direction much more actively, which I think is wise and an important thing to do. And then you asked about Australia and middle powers trying to keep some of these rules, and that's, you know, that's the focus of a number of different initiatives, institutions, organisations to try and keep these rules going strong. We're doing our best to do that because, as you said at the very outset, these rules and norms and institutions have served Australia very well. And we would argue that they've served other countries in the region well, and they do well to continue to support them. I think the best way that we can demonstrate that these rules and institutions are beneficial is to show that they work, that they are beneficial, that they can lead to the kind of development and the kind of environment in which we all can be better off. But it's an extremely difficult challenge because all of this volatility, all of this fragmentation is pulling apart. You know, the tendency for pulling apart now is very, very strong. And that ideal that we have of holding together is facing an enormous challenge. So we're certainly going to have to do a great deal more in order to keep the system together.
All right, thanks very much. Unsurprisingly, we're getting a large number of questions that have got China in them, so I'll just pick a few eyes of these ones. Question about New Zealand's continuing relationship with China and how that compares with Australia and what China might be, advantage China might be trying to make because of the differences on the one hand. Another question about China and the US having common ground in addressing climate change. To what degree is that a role model for countries such as Australia? And then a question from Christopher Skinner about carrier task force build up in the South China Sea, which does beg the broader question about the South China Sea and where that fits in the sort of geostrategic mix at the moment. What views would you have about that as a hotspot, particularly in China? And then finally, from at this stage for China, there may well be more questions coming, but from Peter McCauley, a question about China being a developing country, and why is there so little discussion in international development circles about China's internal development challenges? So that's a broader question, which we'd really like to get your insights from your long experience in China about how China manages its own problem areas.
Great. Well, that's plenty to be going on with. Thank you. Let's start from the top. Sorry, I'm choking a little bit.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. So the first question about the New Zealand-China relationship is a really interesting one. And I think we're seeing growing interest in how New Zealand is managing its relationship with China. And there's a few big differences between the Australia-China relationship and the New Zealand-China relationship. And the first and most obvious one is size. Australia is a middle power. It wants to have a voice and a role in the world. It wants to be influential in the world. And New Zealand comes at global affairs from a very different angle. It's much more distanced from the United States. I mean, although it's one of the Five Eyes, it's never had quite the same alliance and relationship as Australia has had with the US. And it also is acutely aware of the way in which its size and its vulnerability means that it has to play the game of international relations. When I was there a few years ago, I was talking to some academics and some diplomats, and they were saying, on one hand, New Zealand is, they were arguing, on one hand, New Zealand is naive and is too open towards China, isn't skeptical enough of China. But on the other hand, they argued New Zealand didn't really have much choice. So New Zealand is playing the game very, very carefully. It's being extremely diplomatic. It cannot afford to antagonize China in the way that Australia seems to have antagonized China. And so far, their relationship seems to have have been better. It's not only about how New Zealand has played it. I'm not trying to suggest that our bilateral relationship with China is, and the situation that it's in, is entirely Australia's fault. China has also has not turned towards New Zealand in the way that it has turned towards Australia, and to try and make an example of it on the international stage. So there are two sides to that story, but China just doesn't see New Zealand in the same light as it sees Australia, and New Zealand sees China in a much more not in a nuance, that in a more ambivalent light than Australia does at this stage, I'd say. But that security concern is there in New Zealand, and it is growing as well. The next question was about China and US climate change cooperation and whether that could be an example for cooperation from Australia. It's really interesting that a lot of the analysis coming out of that Earth Day summit on April 22nd talks about, you know, what a diplomatic coup in a way it was that President Biden got himself, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and Russian President Vladimir Putin, among others, in the same virtual room to discuss this issue, to discuss a global public good, a cross-border threat and a global public good. And that's fantastic. But by no means should it be read as an opportunity for cooperation that is overcoming the strategic competition that the two countries are in. Both of them want to be seen as the leader, the global leader on climate change, and as does the EU as well, incidentally. Both of them want to be taking a leadership role on this. It was interesting to observe that Xi Jinping, President Xi, didn't accept Biden's invitation until a couple of days before the summit. So he was very clearly demonstrating that he was in no hurry to be looking like he was eager to attend a party that Biden was hosting. So, you know, it looks like it could be an opportunity for cooperation, but in fact, what it looks like, how it's playing out, is that the jockeying for power and the kind of national interest agenda is still taking over and is still at the core of climate change. And what we're not seeing is cooperation. What we are seeing is more competition. So unfortunately, no, I don't think that's a good example for Australia. And hopefully we'll be able to do it in a slightly different way. The third question is about the South China Sea. And I'm just going to have to take a second sip of water again, sorry. The South China Sea, thank you. Solidarity, everyone have a moment and take a sip of water. So the South China Sea has not gone away as an issue area. And indeed, you know, when we're thinking about the potential for future conflict or for future global tensions, or certainly regional tensions, but even on a global scale, the South China Sea is one of the major potential trigger points, because while nobody in the region wants conflict, that is the place where an accidental collision or an unintended event could very quickly and easily escalate. And part of the reason for that is because of this broader geopolitical environment and this environment of mistrust and very few communications. You know, you'll know, for example, that Australia and China haven't had a high-level conversation for a very long time now. That the way in which communications have been stripped out of our region means that if there is an accidental incident in the South China Sea, it can very quickly escalate into something much more severe than it was ever meant to be. And accidental collisions happen all the time, especially, you know, with more and more, we're seeing more and more operations in the area, counter operations in the area. So the potential for the South China Sea to be a trigger point for conflict is growing, I think, all the time, and should be seen as an area of considerable concern. And then the last question here is about China as a developing country. Why there's so little discussion in international development circles about the domestic challenges within China about development. My own experience working in the United Nations for Development, the United Nations Development Program in China, there was a lot of conversations about China and the enormous swathes of China that are still terribly poor and underdeveloped. But the problem is that these organizations have a particular kind of formula that they apply to work out how much development aid they can give to a particular place. And it's about, it's a very complicated formula. It involves GDP, it involves GDP per capita, it involves all sorts of numbers of indicators. And how that ends up coming out often means that funding for China cannot be particularly high. It's not considered to be, according to that formula, that it needs that kind of aid. But what those organizations are trying to do is provide technical cooperation or technical support and assist in other ways. So there's still, the UN has a strong presence, UNDP has a strong presence, and other aid agencies have as much of a presence as they can justify according to that formula to try and help with the very real problem of poverty in the center and the west of China. But also the Chinese government is extremely aware of this, and their most recent 5-year plan, which came out early this year, focuses very much on trying to reduce that inequality, on trying to ensure that the wealth of the East is being redistributed to those in the central and western areas that still are very poor. So that's definitely an area that I think is still on people's minds, but it's very difficult to provide aid funding because of that formulaic system.
Great, thanks very much. Kim Boyer from AIIA in Tasmania is asking a bit more about the IT issues that you were referring to, technology divide issues, where you're talking about decoupling platforms between US and China, but where does Russia fit in with that?
Right, great question. Yeah, obviously, this China and the US are not the only actors in this game, but it's a system in which whoever sets the global standards and gets people to align to their particular standards, they're going to be preeminent in the space. So if we're thinking about 5G, both infrastructure and the soft aspects of it, Russia probably isn't going to be developing its own systems and its own standards. Some countries are trying to, Vietnam, for example, but for the most part, if it's not 5G, in other areas of technological and data development, the standards are going to be set, the investments are going to be made by the US and by China. And other countries will have to decide which set of standards and which systems they want to follow. And I think that applies to Russia. I don't think that they're right at the forefront of digital and AI in a way that could push either of those major actors out of the picture. So there are some areas in which countries are trying to maintain their independence. And as I mentioned, Vietnam is one of them. But overall, there's going to be a system that is created, but there's going to be two systems that are created. And we're all going to be needing to align ourselves into one or the other, which raises enormous questions about interoperability from an intelligence or defense point of view, but also from a business and trade point of view. If countries in Southeast Asia, for example, align themselves with the Chinese system and we align ourselves with the US system, how are we going to be able to communicate? What will be the security and just practical challenges of crossing over those boundaries between the two systems?
Great, thank you. Now we're going back to China, I think, and a couple of questions there about the muted response from China to the emerging military coup in Myanmar. From Rachel Phillip. What risks does a muted approach have for China? And also a question from Tomo Sugano, who's asking about the recent assertive behaviour of the CCP regime. Does that reflect a lack of domestic confidence in the CCP leadership? So a couple of questions there.
Great, thank you. I'm going to answer the second one first, about the recent assertive behaviour of the CCP and whether or not that suggests that there's domestic discontent with the leadership. I would argue that exactly the opposite is true. What we're seeing in China is a wholesale increase in confidence. We're seeing that, with this inverted commas, wolf warrior diplomacy and foreign policy. And we're seeing this on the ground among Chinese people, the middle class in particular, the educated and wealthy and the elite. There is so much confidence in the system, in the government and the party at the moment, that it's quite extraordinary. So in the past, the majority of the Chinese population probably didn't get involved in conversations about politics. And that's still largely true for many people. So there's still kind of, let's say, half the population that doesn't involve themselves in conversations about politics and just broadly accepts it. So long as things are going okay, they're comfortable with the situation. But there's this growing amount, this growing number of people, particularly in cities like Beijing, which are more political than others, who is aware of what's going on and who are extremely supportive of it, who are extremely supportive of Beijing's proactive stance in the world, who are extremely supportive of the way that Beijing has handled COVID, and who are just really really supportive of the way in which the way in which Beijing is behaving on the world stage and this assertive behavior. So it's not a means to try and distract at the moment. Everyone is behind this. Everyone is on board, really. I should say that this doesn't equate to kind of complete blind loyalty to the CCP. You'll still definitely have people who distinguish, the party from the nation state. But even those people will acknowledge, I think, generally speaking, that while they may not love the CCP, they believe that the CCP has done a great job and is bringing China back into this Xi Jinping's narrative of the China dream, this rejuvenation story. So there's enormous support for the party right now. This is not diminishing, and assertiveness is not a reflection of insecurity right now in China. And I wouldn't say for the next few years at the very least. The first question.
Yeah.
Was thinking about the Chinese middle class. The muted response to Myanmar. China still operates on an idea, a rhetoric of non-interference, non-political interference. So it cannot be seen to have an overt support for either side. And also its relationship with Myanmar and Myanmar politics is extremely complicated. When the military was in power before Aung San Suu Kyi was elected, their relationship with the military was very fraught. The military suspected China of supporting rebels and insurgents in the country, and there was a lot of mistrust between those two. Aung San Suu Kyi opened up Myanmar to Chinese investment, so there was a little bit more support there. But I think China wants to be able to operate in Myanmar. It wants things to be as stable as possible so that it can operate in Myanmar. It's got a lot of investments in there. And honestly, I don't think it cares about the ideology of who's in power, so long as it can get on with those kinds of investments and that kind of engagement. So I think it's muted for its own interests, and not particularly because it has a political or ideological position that it wants to promote.
All right. Now, I've got a question from David Hall. What can Australia do to enhance its strategic partnership with Indonesia? I think that's a very good question in light of Indonesia's projected economic growth and expanding trade and investment relations. But how does business view the relationship with Indonesia these days?
Yeah, that's great. A really good question. And late last year, there was a really good, dialogue between some Indonesian diplomats and some Australian diplomats and some think tankers as well to discuss exactly, how could we improve the relationship and how could we build on it? And there's a lot of narrative about the areas within which, the areas of potential in our relationship. There's a lot of business potential. But again, I was talking about diversification a little bit earlier. There's also a lot of complications. And Indonesia has, you know, a market that is a very, very solid size and is very appealing to Australian exporters and Australian investors. But the complexities of doing business in Indonesia are a whole new ballpark, a whole new game that needs to be learnt and understood for Australian businesses. So, you know, to increase our strategic partnership, you know, first of all, we have to really better understand each other. And I think that's one of the major impediments to our relationship overall. From what I understand from the Indonesian point of view, there's a strong sense that Australia is a little bit paternalistic, a little bit condescending, presumes that its interests are also Indonesia's interests. And, you know, I'm not saying that's true of every individual, but an overall kind of framework. And from the Indonesian academics that I've spoken to, there's a strong sense that if Australia wants more from Indonesia, Australia is going to have to give Indonesia a little bit more of what it wants. And those may be in areas that Australia doesn't feel comfortable in compromising on. So there's potential there. The rhetoric is there. The documents are signed. But the complexities and nuances of the relationship, you know, the realities of it need a lot more time and investment, I think, from both sides to really bear fruit.
Great. While we're on Indonesia, maybe one of Indonesia's neighbours, Singapore. We haven't mentioned tonight, I don't think, but how does business view the relationship with Singapore, or indeed as one of those middle power countries? To what degree would you say Singapore is a good partner in those endeavours?
I think, I mean, you know, again, I can't speak for the whole business community, but I think Singapore is very much viewed as a trusted partner for Australian business. That there's a lot of goodwill there, but also a lot of trust in the institutions. Of course, the tax environment is particularly favourable for foreign investment, so that's something that is of great interest. But there's a sense that in Singapore you can trust the institutions, that the rule of law is strong, that regulations are what they say they're going to be, and that's a very good environment to do business in. Obviously, it's not an enormous market, but in terms of what it is that we can do together, there's a strong sense that it's a good partner to do business with.
And there was a codicil to that question, I might say, from Margaret Valentin, who's asking what technological camp is Singapore opting to join in terms of the previous discussion? Yeah.
It's hard to say. I mean, countries don't want to clearly align. You know, the countries in Southeast Asia and our Indo-Pacific region, you know, are talking about these horses. Now they're trying to avoid very hard choosing a horse, and they're hoping that this situation is going to somehow resolve itself before they have to choose one horse or the other. So it's very unclear. You know, we can sort of make good estimates on where some countries might find themselves aligned. But for many, I think they're very, very strategic ambiguity is the way that they're playing this, and for probably very good reason.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I might get one or two more questions. If I could perhaps ask you to chance your hand without speaking for all of business, but to what degree or where would you think improvements could be made in Australia's diplomatic approach to the region, particularly in addressing these risks and these emerging threats? Where could Australia improve its game?
So you're asking where could Australia improve its diplomatic game?
Particularly in the diplomatic sphere, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely not speaking for all of business then in this one, but Australia has a very skilled network of diplomats. You know, and we are well versed in a lot of the challenges and the nuances of our region. Our diplomats know what they're doing for the most part, I'm sure, and they're very good at it. But where things get difficult is where diplomatic communication meets politics. And it's politics that starts to undermine those diplomatic networks and those diplomatic capabilities. So I really think our diplomatic network is good and strong and capable, but it's when we start to hit, you know, when we lead up into elections and when our public rhetoric around foreign policy starts to become a little bit less nuanced and a little bit more sharp, that our diplomatic efforts are challenged by that broader political environment.
Well, look, thanks so much, Merriden. You've taken us through so many nooks and crannies in our journey through the changes in the region, the drivers for all of those issues. I'd like to, on behalf of the ACT branch of the AIIA, thank you so very much for presenting us your insights. And we hope that we can invite you to come in person to Canberra at some stage, and indeed visit you in KPMG later on. Before we finish, I'd like to remind people that the next ACT branch event will be on 19 May, when we will be hearing from Judy Betts and Mark Fithian, who are the co-authors of a new study on Australia and Britain's decision to go to war against Iraq in 2003. So that meeting will be held in person here at Stephen House and online. So we encourage you to register for that talk. So in the meantime, good evening to all, and until we meet again. Thanks again to Merriden.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Good night.
See you.